most psychologically devastating moment for an avoidant occurs when they finally realize that you haven't just temporarily withdrawn or created distance, you've completely disappeared from their emotional landscape and psychological reality. This realization triggers what therapists call abandonment terror, a primal panic response that shatters their carefully constructed defenses and forces them to confront the permanent loss of their secure base. Unlike their typical emotional distance, this panic represents raw, unfiltered attachment desperation that contradicts everything they believed about their emotional independence. Their realization, the moment when reality hits, the realization that you've genuinely disappeared rather than just temporarily withdrawn, often hits avoidance in stages, building from subtle unease to devastating clarity that forces them to confront the finality of their loss. This recognition doesn't happen immediately. It develops over months as evidence accumulates that you've moved beyond their emotional reach and built a life that genuinely doesn't include them. The first stage of realization typically involves noticing that their usual methods of monitoring your emotional state have become ineffective. They can no longer gauge your feelings about them through social media activity, mutual friend reports, or subtle signs that previously indicated your continued emotional investment. This absence of readable signals creates the first flutter of anxiety about whether they still maintain psychological importance in your life. The second stage emerges when they recognize that you're not just avoiding them, but have genuinely redirected your emotional energy toward other people and pursuits. Instead of seeing you waiting or hoping for their return, they witness you building meaningful connections, pursuing personal goals, and demonstrating happiness that clearly doesn't depend on their presence or potential return. The third stage involves recognizing that you've integrated the experience of losing them without it devastating your emotional well-being or life trajectory. Rather than remaining stuck in relationship patterns or pining for their return, you've processed the loss and moved forward with obvious strength and resilience that challenges their assumptions about your emotional dependency. The fourth stage brings awareness that you've not only moved on, but potentially upgraded your circumstances, entering healthier relationships, achieving personal goals, or building a social life that appears more fulfilling than what you shared together. This recognition that losing them might have actually benefited you rather than diminished you creates profound cognitive dissonance. The fifth and most devastating stage occurs when they realize that they've become genuinely irrelevant to your emotional landscape. You're not avoiding them out of hurt or anger. You simply don't think about them at all. This recognition that they've lost even the power to hurt you represents the ultimate loss of psychological control and importance. The timeline of this realization often spans 12 to 24 months, coinciding with their typical attachment panic window, but extending beyond it as they gradually comprehend the permanent nature of your emotional departure. Each stage builds on the previous recognition, creating cumulative psychological pressure that eventually reaches a breaking point. The trigger for final realization often involves a specific event: seeing you happy with someone new, learning about a major life achievement they weren't part of, or simply recognizing that sufficient time has passed, that you could have processed the relationship loss and moved forward completely. This trigger moment forces them to confront that their window for return may have permanently closed. The emotional impact of this realization typically exceeds anything they experienced during the actual relationship ending, because it forces them to confront not just the loss of you as a person, but the loss of their ability to return to you, if they ever chose to. This double loss, both the relationship and the option of future reconnection, creates attachment panic that overwhelms their usual coping mechanisms. The realization also forces them to confront their own role in creating this outcome through their emotional unavailability and relationship patterns. Unlike external losses they can blame on circumstances, They must acknowledge that their current situation results from their own choices and behaviors, creating additional psychological distress. Their behavior, the desperate actions that follow. When the full weight of realization hits avoidance, their behavior typically undergoes dramatic changes that contradict their usual emotional distance and control. These behavioral shifts represent their attachment system's emergency response to perceived permanent abandonment and often include actions that feel completely out of character for someone who previously valued independence above connection. The initial behavioral response often involves frantic information gathering as they attempt to understand the extent of your emotional disconnection and whether any possibility for reconnection still exists. They may begin monitoring your social media obsessively, questioning mutual friends about your well-being and relationship status, or even conducting internet searches to learn about your current circumstances. Communication attempts typically escalate during this phase, progressing from casual messages to increasingly desperate attempts at contact. They may send lengthy emails detailing their feelings, leave voicemails expressing regret about their behavior, or attempt to reach you through multiple platforms and intermediaries when direct contact fails to generate responses. Physical proximity seeking often emerges as they attempt to re-establish connection through presence rather than communication. This might involve showing up at your workplace, appearing at social events they know you'll attend, or engineering accidental encounters that allow them to gauge your emotional state and test your availability for reconnection. Social media behavior typically becomes erratic as they struggle with their desire to maintain dignity while desperately seeking signs of your continued emotional investment. They may post content designed to trigger your attention, share memories from your relationship, or engage with your posts in ways that feel increasingly inappropriate or boundary violating. Their lifestyle patterns often change dramatically as they attempt to cope with their emotional crisis. They may begin drinking more heavily, sleeping less, or engaging in impulsive behaviors that represent attempts to manage the overwhelming anxiety of potential permanent loss. These changes often affect their work performance, physical health, and other relationships. Professional help seeking may emerge during this phase as they recognize that their emotional response exceeds their usual coping capacity. However, their motivation for therapy or counseling is typically focused on winning you back rather than addressing their fundamental attachment issues, making the therapeutic work less effective. Relationship behavior with others often becomes more emotionally available as they attempt to practice vulnerability and connection skills they never developed during your relationship. However, these relationships often serve as testing grounds for behaviors they hope to demonstrate to you, rather than authentic connections with new people. Their communication with mutual friends typically becomes more emotionally intense as they seek allies who might advocate for reconciliation or provide information about your feelings and availability. This can create uncomfortable situations for friends who feel pressured to take sides or violate your privacy. Risk-taking behaviors often increase during this phase as they attempt to manage their emotional overwhelm through distraction or self-punishment. This might include dangerous driving, excessive exercise, financial recklessness, or other behaviors that represent externalization of their internal emotional chaos. The boundary testing escalates as their desperation increases and their usual respect for social conventions becomes overshadowed by their need to re-establish connection. They may contact your family members, show up at your home uninvited, or engage in behaviors that feel stalking-like, despite their genuine belief that they're simply trying to save the relationship. Their coping strategy, how they try to manage the panic. Faced with the overwhelming reality of your permanent emotional departure, avoidants typically employ a combination of healthy and unhealthy coping strategies as they attempt to manage their attachment panic while preserving whatever remains of their emotional defenses. These strategies often contradict their usual approach to emotional management and represent desperate attempts to survive psychological trauma. Denial and rationalization often serve as their primary coping mechanisms as they attempt to minimize the reality of your emotional disconnection. They may convince themselves that you're just taking longer to process the relationship, that you'll eventually reach out when you're ready, or that your apparent happiness without them is temporary or performative rather than genuine. Bargaining behaviors emerge as they attempt to negotiate their way back into your emotional consideration. This might involve promises of dramatic personal change, offers to meet any conditions you might set for reconciliation, or attempts to demonstrate their value through grand gestures or significant life changes that they hope will capture your attention. Idealization of the relationship becomes a common coping strategy as they focus obsessively on positive memories while minimizing or forgetting the emotional limitations that originally drove you away. This selective memory allows them to maintain hope for reconciliation while avoiding confrontation with their own role in the relationship's failure. Replacement relationships often serve as coping mechanisms as they attempt to recreate the emotional security you provided while proving to themselves and others that they can maintain intimate connections. However, these relationships typically fail because they're seeking your specific qualities rather than building authentic connections with new people. Self-improvement efforts may emerge as they attempt to address the personal limitations they believe cost them your love. They might begin therapy, pursue career advancement, improve their physical health, or develop new interests, though these efforts are often motivated by desire to win you back, rather than authentic personal growth. Social isolation alternates with desperate social connection as they struggle between their usual avoidant patterns and their newfound recognition of their need for emotional support. They may withdraw completely to avoid confronting reminders of their loss, then suddenly reach out intensively to friends or family when the isolation becomes unbearable. Substance use often increases during this period as they attempt to manage the overwhelming anxiety and depression that accompanies their attachment panic. Alcohol, drugs, or other addictive behaviors may provide temporary relief from the emotional intensity they are unable to process through their usual suppression mechanisms. Work obsession frequently serves as both distraction and identity reinforcement as they attempt to maintain some sense of competence and control while their emotional life feels chaotic. However, their emotional distress often affects their professional performance despite their increased time investment. Fantasy and rumination become prominent coping strategies as they create elaborate mental scenarios about potential reunion while analyzing every interaction you've had for signs of continued emotional investment. This mental preoccupation provides temporary comfort while preventing them from accepting the reality of their situation. Physical exercise or other intense activities may serve as emotional regulation tools as they attempt to manage their anxiety and depression through endorphin release and physical exhaustion. However, these activities often become compulsive rather than healthy as they try to avoid sitting with their overwhelming feelings. Their return, the desperate attempt at reconnection. When their coping strategies fail to provide adequate relief from their attachment panic, and they recognize that passive hoping won't restore your connection, many avoidants attempt dramatic returns that represent complete abandons of their usual emotional distance and control. These return attempts often feel surreal to former partners because they contradict everything the avoidant previously demonstrated about their capacity for emotional expression and vulnerability. The return typically begins with unprecedented emotional transparency as they abandon their usual communication patterns in favor of direct expressions of their feelings, explicit acknowledgments of their mistakes, and detailed explanations of how losing you has affected them. This emotional openness often exceeds anything they provided during the actual relationship and represents genuine desperation rather than calculated manipulation. Grand gesture behaviors often characterize their return attempts as they try to demonstrate the depth of their feelings and their commitment to change through dramatic actions that contrast sharply with their previous emotional minimalism. These gestures might include public declarations of love, expensive gifts, surprise appearances, or other behaviors designed to capture your attention and prove their seriousness. Promise-making escalates during their return as they offer everything you previously requested from them: emotional availability, future planning, public acknowledgement of the relationship, and commitment to addressing their avoidant patterns. These promises often include specific behavioral changes, therapeutic commitments, or lifestyle modifications designed to address the issues that originally drove you away. Negotiation tactics emerge as they attempt to bargain their way back into your consideration by offering to accept any terms or conditions you might set for renewed contact. This willingness to accommodate your needs represents complete reversal of their previous need to control relationship dynamics and demonstrates their desperation to regain access to you. Third-party recruitment often becomes part of their return strategy as they enlist mutual friends, family members, or other intermediaries to advocate for their case and communicate their feelings when direct contact proves ineffective. This use of social pressure represents abandonment of their usual preference for handling relationships privately and independently. Persistence escalation characterizes their return efforts as they refuse to accept your rejection and continue attempting contact through multiple channels and methods. This persistence often crosses boundaries and may feel intrusive or overwhelming as their desperation overrides their usual respect for social conventions and personal space. Identity reformation may accompany their return as they attempt to demonstrate that they've become a different person who can meet your emotional needs. This might involve dramatic lifestyle changes, new social circles, different career paths, or other modifications designed to prove their transformation and worthiness of reconsideration. Timeline manipulation often emerges as they attempt to create urgency around their return by suggesting that this is their final attempt at reconciliation, that they're moving away soon, or that other circumstances make immediate reunion necessary. This manufactured scarcity is designed to pressure you into responding before you've had time to fully consider their offer. Emotional appeals typically intensify as their other strategies fail, with increasingly desperate expressions of love, regret, and need designed to trigger your sympathy or reactivate your emotional investment. These appeals often include declarations about how much they've changed, how much they understand now, and how different things would be if given another chance. The psychology behind their panic, understanding the attachment crisis. The intensity of the avoidant's final panic, when they realize you've disappeared, stems from a fundamental attachment crisis that challenges every psychological defense they've built throughout their lives. This crisis represents the collision between their deep-seated need for connection and their equally strong fear of vulnerability, creating psychological chaos that overwhelms their usual coping mechanisms. The panic emerges because their attachment system, which has been suppressed and denied for years, suddenly becomes fully activated by the threat of permanent abandonment. While they've successfully avoided attachment feelings during relationships by maintaining emotional distance, your complete disappearance eliminates their ability to maintain the illusion of control over connection and forces them to confront their genuine emotional needs. Their psychological defenses, which are designed to protect them from the vulnerability of needing others, become ineffective when faced with the reality of permanent loss. The possibility that they may never again have access to your love and support forces them to confront how much they actually depended on your presence for emotional regulation and security. The competitive aspect of their psychology also contributes to their panic, as they realize they've lost a game They didn't realize they were playing. Throughout the relationship, they maintained unconscious confidence in their ability to regain your attention and affection whenever they chose to invest effort. Your permanent departure eliminates this option and forces them to confront that they may have permanently lost something valuable. The timing factor amplifies their panic because it often coincides with their natural attachment cycle reaching its peak. Many avoidants experience delayed attachment responses 12 to 24 months after relationship endings, and if your disappearance coincides with this timeline, it creates perfect conditions for maximum psychological distress. Their identity crisis contributes significantly to their panic, as they're forced to confront that their self-concept as an emotionally independent person may have been largely illusory. Your ability to completely disconnect and thrive without them challenges their belief in their own importance and forces them to examine whether they've been deceiving themselves about their emotional needs. The recognition of their own role in creating their current situation adds additional psychological pressure, as they must confront that their panic and loss result from their own choices and behavioral patterns. This self-blame component makes their distress feel deserved and eliminates their ability to externalize responsibility for their emotional state. The future implications of their realization also contribute to their panic as they confront the possibility that they may be fundamentally unsuited for intimate relationships and may face a lifetime of emotional isolation if they cannot address their attachment limitations. This existential fear about their capacity for love and connection creates additional urgency around their need to reconnect with you. The aftermath, what happens when return attempts fail. When avoidants' desperate return attempts fail to restore connection and they're forced to accept the permanence of your departure, they typically enter a psychological aftermath period characterized by profound grief, identity reconstruction, and either significant personal growth or deeper entrenchment in their avoidant patterns. Initial devastation often overwhelms their emotional system as they exhaust their coping resources and are forced to sit with the full weight of their loss without hope for reunion. This devastation typically exceeds anything they experienced during the original relationship ending because it includes recognition of their own role in creating their situation and the finality of their circumstances. Identity reconstruction becomes necessary as they're forced to rebuild their self-concept without the security of knowing you remain emotionally accessible. This reconstruction may involve either accepting their limitations and building life around them, or committing to the personal growth work necessary to develop greater emotional capacity for future relationships. Depression and anxiety often emerge or intensify during this period as they process the full implications of their loss while confronting their own emotional limitations. These mental health challenges may persist for months or years and often require professional intervention to address effectively. Social withdrawal frequently occurs as they struggle to maintain their usual social connections while processing their emotional crisis. Friends and family may notice significant changes in their personality, energy, and emotional availability as they grapple with attachment feelings they've never processed. Personal growth potential exists during this crisis period as the breakdown of their psychological defenses creates opportunities for authentic self-examination and development. Some avoidants use this crisis as motivation for genuine therapeutic work and emotional development that improves their capacity for future relationships. Alternatively, deeper avoidance patterns may emerge as they respond to their attachment crisis by strengthening their emotional defenses and committing more deeply to independence and emotional distance. This response often leads to increased difficulty with future relationships and greater emotional isolation over time. Relationship impact typically extends beyond their connection with you as their attachment crisis affects their approach to all relationships. They may become more emotionally available with others as they recognize their need for connection, or more avoidant as they seek to prevent future emotional devastation. The learning potential from this experience varies significantly based on their response to the crisis. Those who use their panic as motivation for self-examination and growth may develop greater emotional capacity, while those who respond defensively may simply become more sophisticated in their avoidance strategies. Long-term outcomes depend largely on whether they receive appropriate support and intervention during their crisis period, and whether they choose to interpret their experience as evidence of their need for growth or confirmation of their fears about emotional vulnerability. The intensity of their panic creates potential for significant positive change, but also risk of deeper psychological entrenchment in dysfunctional patterns. Understanding the psychological mechanics of their final panic provides insight into the depth of attachment feelings that avoidants typically suppress, and the genuine emotional capacity that exists beneath their defensive patterns. While their panic may be validating for former partners who questioned whether they ever truly cared, it's important to recognize that panic alone doesn't indicate readiness for healthy relationship or capacity for sustained emotional availability without significant personal development work.